After a brutal assault that lasted almost 2 weeks and killed hundreds of Palestinians, a truce has been agreed between Hamas and the Israeli occupation to bring the May war to a ceasefire. Both sides claim victory, but victory means different things to each of them. So let's take a closer look. I'm Richard Medhurst, and you're watching the Communique. After 11 days of Israeli airstrikes and bombardment of the Gaza Strip, an Egyptian-brokered ceasefire came into effect on May 21st at 2 a.m. local time. Since then, the ceasefire has largely held, even though Israel continued to bomb Gaza right up until the last minute. All in all, 12 Israelis were killed. Meanwhile, 250-plus Palestinians, almost half of them women and children, were slaughtered by Israel in the most vicious war since the ground invasion in 2014. Despite the agreement to a ceasefire, the very next day, Israel continued to tear gas Palestinians at the Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. Israeli forces had stormed the very same mosque, which is the third holiest site in Islam, just 12 days before, which ignited the war in the first place. In addition, Israel also continued its brutality through mass arrests targeting Palestinians who were protesting and raiding their houses even.
فرجوا حسبي الله هنادي
The whole point of Palestinians rallying and marching in the streets was that they wanted an end to the occupation. They wanted to live in peace and to be rid of this oppression. Instead, the Israelis respond with increased brutality and disproportionate violence. Even in a delicate situation just like this, the Israelis doubled down and continue to desecrate the Aqsa Mosque and to treat Palestinians like less than human. This is what the Israeli occupation is: oppression. The Israelis have long used disproportionate force as a standard practice in their tactics. This is known as the Dahiya Doctrine, named after a neighborhood in the Lebanese capital, Beirut, which was completely decimated in the 2006 war. Israel then implemented this doctrine of disproportionate violence against Palestinians during its war in Gaza in 2009, 2014, and now again in 2021. This is a practice that actually dates further back to the days of the first Zionist paramilitary groups in Palestine who would kill Arabs, British troops, and even non-Zionist Jews. Gaza has a population of 2 million Palestinians who live in a tiny enclave which is completely cut off from the rest of the world and subject to a blockade by Israel and Egypt since 2007. The resources are already extremely limited, and Gaza has been rightfully dubbed the world's largest open-air prison. It's extremely important to underline the brutality that Israel employs against Palestinians on a regular basis and who is behind it. Just in the span of 11 days, we saw Israel completely decimate Gaza's water, electricity, and health infrastructure. Gaza has 10 electricity lines that deliver power to its residents. Israeli shelling caused 6 of them to go offline. The spokesperson for Gaza's power distribution plant said that residents are now getting maybe 5 hours of electricity a day, as opposed to 12 hours before the attack. Hundreds of thousands of people in Gaza had their water supply cut off when a desalination plant was put out of action. The water system was damaged so badly that human waste and sewage began overflowing onto the streets. Israel continued to strike health facilities, hospitals, and clinics. One of Gaza's most important doctors, Dr. Abu Al-Louf, worked at Al-Shifa Hospital, which is the biggest in Gaza, and taught other medical students. He was killed by an Israeli airstrike at his home along with 12 other members of his family. Several other Palestinian families were also completely wiped out. And speaking of Al-Shifa Hospital, Israel damaged roads leading there, which made it harder for victims and the wounded to be treated in the first place. The only clinic able to carry out COVID-19 testing in Gaza was damaged, as were several other government clinics and clinics belonging to NGOs. And after all, this is nothing new, as we've seen Israel purposely kill medical staff, doctors, and nurses in the past. Just a few months ago, Israel was blocking vaccines from entering Gaza and only inoculating Jewish settlers in the West Bank and Jerusalem. This is another form of oppression, and we have to call it for what it is, a medical apartheid. And as a result of the latest strikes on Gaza, the UN reported that 50 schools were damaged, which impacted over 40,000 children, according to Save the Children and UNRWA, the Palestinian Refugee Agency. 47,000 people have been pushed to use schools as shelters, and schools still remain closed. Israel also bombed the offices of the international press, leveling a 12-story building that used to house the offices of Al Jazeera and the Associated Press. And this is once again something that Israel does regularly. It targets journalists on purpose, Palestinian and non-Palestinian alike, because it doesn't want people to document its crimes. The situation in Gaza was already bad enough from previous wars, so bad that many things damaged in 2014 and before that have still not been rebuilt to begin with, making the effects of further Israeli aggression even more apparent. Officials in Gaza have estimated that reconstruction will cost millions of dollars and take years. Gaza's Public Works and Housing Ministry told OCHA that nearly 17,000 residential and commercial units were either damaged or completely destroyed. Around 80,000 people have either lost their homes or had their homes damaged, according to Al Jazeera. And when it comes to casualties, once again, the death toll is incomparable. The vast majority of casualties are Palestinians. In less than 2 weeks, Israel massacred 244 Palestinians. Half of those were women and children. In contrast, 12 Israelis were killed. These figures illustrate the imbalance and ruthlessness of the Israelis. According to the UN, 5,591 Palestinians have been killed versus 251 Israelis in the years between 2008 and 2020. The number of injured is also extremely disproportionate. So why is it that there are so many Palestinians killed, and why are so many of them civilians? Do the Israelis not know where their bombs are landing? Do the Israelis not know where their shells are going? Of course they do. In 2018, the Israeli occupation forces even bragged about this on Twitter, saying, quote, "We know where every bullet landed." This was during the right to return marches, when Palestinians were gathering at the border fence to protest, demanding to return to their homes and the homes of their parents and grandparents after they had been kicked out during the Israeli takeover and ethnic cleansing in 1948. Israel purposely shot Palestinians in the knees, killed medical staff, killed journalists, and then bragged about it. And here, once again, in 2021, we have a disproportionate amount of casualties on the Palestinian side, and not just casualties, but damage and destruction to public and health facilities. This is a war crime, a brazen war crime under the Geneva Convention. Israel kills 20 times more Palestinians, destroys their homes, destroys their infrastructure with overwhelming firepower, and then claims victory while also pretending it's a victim at the same time. And who is behind all this? The West, of course. The West not only gives Israel weapons and logistical support, but also political protection. After all, the United Kingdom helped create Israel when it issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917, promising a Jewish homeland in Palestine. In 1947, it gave up its mandate and left, allowing the United Nations to carve up Palestine and give Palestinians a mere 50% of their land. And Zionist militias consequently took over, and here we are. And ever since, the United States has provided weapons and other material support. Since World War II, Israel is the largest cumulative recipient of foreign aid from the U.S. Just in 2016, under Barack Obama, Israel received a $38 billion package in military aid over 10 years. That means every single year, the United States gives Israel $3.8 billion to continue bombing and killing Palestinians. Even amid all this violence, an Israeli force is desecrating Al-Aqsa Mosque, brutalizing protesters, bombing Gaza. U.S. President Joe Biden goes ahead and approves a weapons sale to the Israelis worth $735 million. We'll be right back after this short break. Joining me is Max Blumenthal, journalist and editor at The Gray Zone. Thanks for coming on, Max. It's good to have you on the program.
Thanks for having me, Richard.
So, Max, I wanted to start out with this recent onslaught on Gaza. U.S. Secretary of State Blinken, British Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, they both visited Netanyahu. They're doing this kind of victory lap now. And you had all these countries groveling over Israel, just tripping over themselves to see who can support Israel the hardest. I mean, what do you make of that, right? Their support during the 11-day attack, especially from Western countries.
Well, the Biden administration entered office assuming that the Abraham Accords, the normalization of Israel with the monarchic colonial cutout states, and Jared Kushner's deal of the century were fully intact, completely safe, and that the Palestinian question or the Palestinian struggle could be put in the icebox. And they were proven wrong by this massive surge of resistance we saw across historic Palestine. Biden was forced to deal with Netanyahu, a figure who he is not necessarily sympathetic to, but this is one of the most pro-Israel former senators in the history of the Senate. And so his natural instinct was to give Israel the time it wanted. As Israel failed militarily and its domestic situation became destabilized, the Biden administration panicked. They began pushing for a ceasefire. And now we see Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, flying to or having flown to Jerusalem in the Holy Land, a place he and the Biden administration did not expect him to be at this juncture. And the program that he is offering is so out of date and out of touch with the reality on the ground. It is another call for a two-state solution and more humanitarian aid to the people of Palestine without dealing with Hamas, and more weapons for Israel. It's the same formula we've seen since the Clinton administration. So the Biden administration is stuck in 1996. And meanwhile, Hamas is at the peak of its credibility after demonstrating its deterrence capacity in this conflict, something the Biden administration and its vassals in the UK and EU are unwilling to reckon with.
And when you say Israel's military failure and that Hamas demonstrated this deterrence capability, could you maybe expand on that? Because both the Israelis and Hamas, they're both claiming victory, right? But there seems to be a clear winner here, and not just militarily at least, but I would also say in public opinion.
Well, in terms of public opinion, the clear victor is Hamas. And this escalation occurred right after Mahmoud Abbas, the sort of permanent ruler of the West Bank cantons and collaborator with the Israeli security forces, had postponed indefinitely the Palestinian Legislative Council elections. So Hamas not only showed itself to be a representative of the Palestinian polity, but also a defender of Jerusalem and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam. So as far as the political metrics, Hamas appears to be the clear winner. Militarily, each side measures its victory in a different way. Israel obviously can destroy much more, but this escalation was not a war that can be looked at in isolation. It's a part of a series of wars that have occurred since the siege of Gaza began in 2005. And so it's a protracted war. And in each escalation, Hamas and the armed factions in the Gaza Strip, Islamic Jihad, PFLP, have demonstrated their ability to improve their capacity to strike deeper into Israeli territory. This time, Hamas broke out of Gaza, actually affected the situation in Jerusalem, and broke through Israel's Iron Dome, striking targets. It orchestrated set-piece attacks over Tel Aviv, something we've never seen before. It cleared the frontiers of Gaza from Israeli military equipment vehicles with its Cornet anti-tank guided missiles. It terrified the Israeli military to the point where Israel faked a ground invasion, something that had gone fairly wrong during the last assault on Gaza in 2014. And it outsmarted Israel when Israel attempted to trick Hamas leadership and Hamas military leadership into going into bunkers and the tunnel system under Gaza City by not falling for that feint. So Israel's major military maneuver actually failed. What Israel achieved turned out to be the destruction of civilian towers, which, as an Air Force pilot revealed, was just an act of frustration, ventilation of the bloodlust of Israeli society, and the killing of many families, removing entire families from the civil registry through massacres. This was Israel's military achievement. And this speaks to another political failure of Israel, or connects to another political failure of Israel we can discuss more in length, which is its loss of the global opinion battle.
Just recently, Egypt has invited Hamas, the PA, and Israel for peace talks, to try and forge a more sustainable truce. What do you think of that? What do you think the outcome of that is going to be?
In each case, Israel has refused to offer anything directly to Hamas and has worked through Egypt, which is emerging more and more as a broker between Hamas and the West, and Qatar. And the agenda has always been that Qatar will inject enough money to keep the status quo going, and slowly Hamas will be domesticated. And that's what Israel believed had happened in the past 7 years. And Hamas demonstrated that that was not in the cards whatsoever. So I think we're going to see more demands from the governors of the Gaza Strip. And they're going to make those demands not just based on the siege of removing the siege from Gaza or improving conditions in Gaza, but also they will be related to the home thefts in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of East Jerusalem. They will be related to the status quo around the Al-Aqsa Mosque. They'll be related to the overall occupation. And that is going to be a new development. And we saw Yahya Sinwar, the prime minister of the Gaza Strip, deliver a press conference in front of the public, and then declare to the Israeli military that he was walking home, walked through the Gaza city and said, if you want to find me, I will be at home, daring them to assassinate him as he was a top target during this escalation. He understands that Hamas has deterred Israel to the point that they will not be assassinating him in the near future.
Yeah, it's quite an astonishing victory. It's quite a shift from what we've seen before. And, just lastly, Max, I saw you wrote this article in the Gray Zone, about this PR campaign where they're trying to portray pro-Palestinian supporters as anti-Semitic. I was wondering if you wanted to expand on that or tell us a bit more about it.
Well, it was inevitable that the Israel lobby in the U.S., after this massive political defeat, after seeing just this unprecedented surge of Palestine solidarity activism in the streets, with protests in places we've never seen protests before, like Pensacola, Florida, big protest in Las Vegas, a large protest in Kansas City, in a country they thought they had on lock, that they would invent a wave of anti-Semitic hate attacks by misrepresenting and distorting video of scuffles between pro-Israel fanatics who were provoking or even physically assaulting Palestine solidarity demonstrators in the streets of New York. And so what I did was basically analyze the video, show how it was deceptively edited, reveal, for example, that a young man who said he was attacked wearing a Jewish skull cap or a kippah in Midtown New York was not actually wearing one. The photos show him wearing a hoodie. There was no way of determining that he was Jewish, and showing that those Palestine solidarity demonstrators who did attack him were actually being provoked and assaulted themselves prior to that. So the Israel lobby is trying to create the specter of anti-Semitism to paint the Jewish public as the ultimate victims of this brutal assault on the Gaza Strip. And at the same time, they're doing what they did in the UK, which is to fabricate or to paint Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, a veteran anti-racist, as a racist anti-Semite. But what they're doing is they're making us all Jeremy Corbyn. They're painting an entire movement as anti-Semitic in a bid to criminalize it. And it's important for people to not fall for it, because we see like progressives in Congress, including Ilhan Omar. We've seen Code Pink issue statements condemning the rise in anti-Semitism. And they are essentially condemning something that has been manufactured by an enemy that seeks to criminalize and remove them from public life. So it's important to call it out for what it is, to be clinical and forensic in analyzing these incidents. And that's what I've done at the Gray Zone and what we'll continue to do.
After 11 days of relentless bombings against Gaza, Israel claimed that it had emerged victorious. This is something that Israel always does for propaganda purposes, even when it's not true. One also wonders how it's possible to speak of victory when half the people Israel kills are not even combatants, but civilians. In 2006, during the war against Lebanon, the Israelis also claimed victory, even though Hezbollah sent them running with advanced weaponry and equipment provided by Iran. Maybe Netanyahu has been victorious in keeping his political rivals at bay and stopping any hopes of a coalition from happening without him, which would put an end to his 12-year rule. Now, he might hold on to power just a little bit longer because, of course, attacking Palestine is always an easy way to unite Zionists under one common banner and distract everyone from internal shortcomings like Netanyahu's corruption scandal or his inability to form a coalition. Now, Netanyahu's claims that he has set back Hamas or deterred them in any way are so outlandish that even other Israelis do not believe him. As history shows, Israel can only ever last a few days at war. It does not have the means to do anything else except maintain an illegal occupation. And this is true of almost every single conflict. Hamas was able to launch over 4,000 rockets, which reached as far as Tel Aviv. They were able to fire more rockets at a much higher rate and up to ranges of 250 kilometers. Their firepower is no joke, and it's thanks to Iran's support for the resistance that they're able to fend off Zionist aggression. Palestinians celebrated the ceasefire all over Gaza, flying flags and taking to the streets, and various Hamas officials thanked Iran for its unwavering support for Palestine and for the resistance. Public opinion worldwide has begun to shift. Hundreds of thousands of people have come out to protest in London. People took to the streets in support of Gaza all over the world, including France, Germany, Spain, Canada, and many more countries where we wouldn't have seen protests before. And although Western governments in general support Israel, the media's pro-Israeli narrative is beginning to lift, and more people are starting to see the reality behind what is happening in Palestine, that it's not just some random conflict, but an occupation. People see the disproportionate force. They see the wrath that Israel unleashes on Palestinians, and they know right from wrong. And in a first for Europe, Ireland's parliament passed a motion condemning the Israeli occupation and recognizing that its occupation of Palestinian land is a de facto annexation. So who emerged victorious from this 11-day assault? The Israelis think they did. And sure, if you think bombing roads and killing children and destroying infrastructure is winning, then yes, Israel won the war crimes contest. Israel claims that it dealt Hamas a huge blow. But this is just to save face. Of course, Israel has a more advanced military and bigger bombs. And what does it do with those things? Military occupation and ethnic cleansing. You think that's something to be proud of? That's disgusting. And the Israelis know it's disgusting, which is why they spend so much time trying to hide their crimes from the world and using their lobby to silence criticism and cover up their occupation and war crimes in Palestine. If people knew what Israel does and understood the reality that Palestinians must live through, they would be mortified, and rightfully so. The Palestinian people have resilience, and they will never allow the Israelis to defeat them, whether in war or in occupation. Palestinians have never been on a level playing field. They have always been at a disadvantage, yet they resist. They do not have planes, tanks, ships, nor nuclear weapons, yet they resist. They are bombed, killed, oppressed, and massacred, yet they resist. Almost the entire world has abandoned Palestine, and yet they still resist. People need to understand something about Palestinians and the Middle East in general. You cannot beat people on their own home turf. At the end of the day, this occupation is taking place in Palestine. This is Palestinian land, and Palestinians will never give it up. They will fight to the death and even beyond, because they know that what they fight for is sacred. They know the value of this earth, this land, their homes, their religions, their people, and their culture. They will not be defeated. The same for Yemenis, the same for Syrians, the same for Iranians and for Lebanese. This is why we talk about al-muqawami, the resistance, because we resist occupation and imperialism together. And no amount of Israeli propaganda or Western media lies will ever change that. So long as Palestine and Palestinians exist, then they are victorious. Israel will never win ultimately because it cannot defeat the Palestinian people and their resolve. Palestinians, along with Yemenis, Syrians, and many others in the Middle East, they all know what they fight for. They fight for their lives, they fight for their land, they fight for their homes, they fight for their families and their neighbors. They fight for their very right to exist. They know the real value and the worth of what lies beneath their feet. They do not have dual nationalities or two homes or the ability to go wherever they want, like the settler colonialists and Zionists who have come to occupy their land and shamelessly rob Palestinians of their homes. Palestinians do not have those luxuries or billions of dollars every year in military aid or the full backing of the West or the mainstream media to cover for them. For Palestinians, this is a matter of life and death. This is existential, and this is why they will never give up and why they can never be defeated. Thanks for tuning in, and long live the resistance. I'm Richard Medhurst, and this is the Communique.